In this video, we are going to fully evaluate a web page. You can and should follow this same sort of process with every source you use for your research. The web page we're looking at is this article on sequestration and the effect it has on student loans. The first criteria we look at is the publisher. Somebody paid for this website to be on the internet. They bought the domain, hired the web designer, and are paying for the electricity for the servers. So who is that, and what do we know about them? Oftentimes there's an About Us link at the top of the page, and if not, there might be one at the bottom of the page or in the copyright notice. If there's not any information about the publisher, well, that tells you something, because no information is information. If there's no publisher, that means that there was no one willing to back this information with their reputation. You don't know their agenda or bias or anything else. So let's consider this case. There's no About Us at the top of the page, but if we scroll down, we do see that there is an About Us towards the bottom of the page, and the copyright notice says the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Alright, so somebody's willing to take this on, but who are these people? Well, we can click the About Think Progress page, and it says that they are a project of the Center for the American Progress Action Fund. They're nonpartisan, which is good, I guess, but then they were also voted Best Liberal Blog, and they have some Webby awards, but nothing really particularly official besides the fact that apparently they had a really good web design. So how can we find out more about the Think Progress group? Well, let's go back and see if we can find out more about this Center for American Progress. And if we click on them, oh, they have an About Us too. And again, they call themselves a nonpartisan education and advocacy organization. But they may not be the best people to talk about themselves. So we have other options. Just like we might have Googled for this information in the first place, we can actually Google the publisher and see what we can find out about them. So why not? Let's go to Wikipedia and see what Wikipedia says. And they actually call them a progressive public policy research. So now we had that they were the best liberal blog. Now somebody else is calling them progressive. Again, they call them a liberal view. So even though they identify themselves as nonpartisan, various other places are calling them very liberal. It's something to consider that maybe they have a bias or an agenda in what they choose to put on their website and how they choose to actually talk about it. So the next thing that we look at is the author. Alright, we have Travis Waldron. Alright, well, who's Travis Waldron and what does he know about sequestration? Is he a politician? Is he an economist? Is he a reporter? Has he reported on education things a lot? Is he a teacher? Well, we can click on his name and we see that he's a reporter and a blogger. He just works here. He has a BA in journalism and political science, but nothing in education or economy, so maybe he's not necessarily got the big background in this that we would hope he does. And his other recent posts all have to do with sports and not so much education or politics. Doesn't really give a lot of confidence in what his expertise may be in this particular topic. But, you know, we can Google him too and see if we can find out other things that he's done. Again, posting mainly on Think Progress, but he's done some tax dodging and things like that. He's basically your generic reporter. He doesn't really have a lot of experience or education in economics, and at least we now know who he is, and if he's on thinkprogress.org and hired by them, maybe he might have the same sort of bias in what he chooses to write as this website. We think we've identified maybe a bias or an agenda, so next thing you want to think about is why did they bother to put this up? Why did they bother to pay Travis to write about this particular thing? I think it's interesting that even though they're a fairly liberal site, they do cite Fox News. That's kind of interesting. But they're writing about sequestration, and they're writing about the negative effects that sequestration is going to have. And they talk a little bit later about how it's affecting education at all levels. And it'll have increased loaning costs and low income. And maybe the reason why they did this is to perhaps reflect negatively on Congress, or to get people to write letters or call their congressmen to help stop this thing. The intended audience. Who's the intended audience of this? Is it written for politicians? Is it written for the congressman? Is it written for the president? Is it written for students? Is it written for voters? Is it written for 10-year-olds? You know, something that's written on a 5th grade reading level is probably not appropriate for a college essay. Does this just summarize what other people have said, or is this offering something new? Next, we want to look at the currency. So this was written on March 18th, 2013. So at least we know when it was written. And again, if you don't know when it was written, well, that tells you something too, because you can't judge, was this very current? Was this written years before the event or years after the event? So at least we know when it was written. But what does that really mean? The sequestration went into effect March 1st. And the things that it's quoting are saying stuff that will happen, but it's saying stuff that will happen very shortly after this event first happened. So it's trying to predict the future, and now that we have a couple months on this event, we can actually maybe look up more recent articles that actually talk about whether these things did happen. Since this is a fairly liberal site and they don't like sequestration, maybe they're being a bit more dire about things than things actually turned out to be. So it's just something to be aware of, is that yes, it's current to what was happening at the time, but because it was so quickly after the event that started after the beginning of sequestration, it doesn't really have the benefit of hindsight. It's trying to guess the future, and now we are in the future and can actually see what did happen rather than trying to guess what will happen. Because the currency of this is so old, even though it's fairly new, that it can't tell us about what happened in the time after this. Finally, you want to look at the accuracy. So it's certainly worth it to check out the site that they are quoting, see if they actually quoted it the right way. You can see how that site actually talked about this particular thing. So are they taking the quote out of context? You can look at the accuracy of the other things that they cited, and it's also worth it to just sort of double check against your own common sense and knowledge of the topic. Is what this person's writing about, does that agree with what you already know about the topic? But you want to be careful with that too, because just because it doesn't agree with what you already know about the topic doesn't mean that it's necessarily incorrect. It may be that you've only looked at one side of the topic and that the other side has points that you need to address or at least think about too before you come up with your viewpoint on the topic. So that's how we fully evaluate something. You don't just say, yes, this was accurate, or no, this wasn't accurate. You don't just say for the currency, it was published when. You tell me, what does that mean? You don't just say this is the author. You say the author is this and they have this education and this background. Or if there is no author, you say I don't know the author, so I don't know their education or background, but they're writing at a fairly high level, so they probably have, at least a high school diploma. That's really what I mean by fully evaluate. Don't just identify the author, don't just tell me who the publisher is, but actually think about and analyze each one of these different criteria.